Before you close your eyes tonight, there's something you ought to know. These mountains, they keep secrets. Inbred bloodlines, forgotten abuse, families swallowed by silence.
There is a house in California where time did not pass. It merely collected, like dust in the corners of a forgotten attic or like breath trapped behind a sealed window. Most people drove past it without noticing anything strange, just another pale, silent home on a sunburned street. But those who lived nearby swore that, at night, something shifted behind those curtains. A flicker, a shadow, as if the house itself were breathing. And every family hides something. But what happens when the secret isn't buried in the backyard or whispered at the dinner table, but grown into the very bones of the house? Tonight, we step into that kind of secret. But for now, just breathe slowly, let the world soften around you, and follow the faint trail of dread that leads to the Turpin family's door. If you've found your way here, you already know. The truth lives in the shadows. Welcome to Underbelly Bloodline, where history bleeds and the past never stays buried. Subscribe if you dare and step deeper into the dark. Because this story, this quiet, aching 2-hour unraveling, begins with a single question. How does a family vanish in plain sight while living right next door? The Turpin home didn't stand apart because it was loud. No screaming, no broken windows, no police cars. Its nightmare was made of silence, a silence so heavy it pressed down on the walls like an extra layer of paint. Some say the curse began long before David and Louise ever moved their children there. That it started in childhood wounds, in unspoken traumas inherited like old heirlooms, generational shadows passed down through the quietness of their own upbringing. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echo behind their story, a subtle rhythm of control, fear, and a need to build a world where no one could ever question them. A world with no windows open, no doors left unlocked, no sunlight allowed to linger too long. From the outside, the Turpins looked almost ordinary. 2 parents, 13 children, matching haircuts, matching clothes, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, photographs that froze them in perfect, unnatural harmony. But a photograph can lie, a smile can be trained, and sometimes when you stare at an old family picture, the longer you look, the more you realize the eyes inside it haven't aged at all. As neighbors walked past that house, some reported a feeling, a soft tug at the back of the mind, as if they were brushing against the edge of an unseen world. A world where childhood didn't mean laughter, but chains, where bedtime didn't bring comfort but fear, where the line between sibling and companion blurred, not from desire, but from a desperate need for connection in a place where connection was forbidden. But we're not there yet. This is only the seed, the soft, unsettling point where a viewer realizes something unspeakably wrong has been growing behind those walls for years. You and I, we are still standing outside the house, listening, watching, feeling the faint pulse of a story that hasn't even begun to bleed. But already, you can sense it, can't you? Something is waiting, something is rising in the dark, something that will unravel, slowly, hour by hour, until the truth stands bare and trembling. And if this is only the beginning, ask yourself, what kind of secret needs walls this thick and silence this deep to survive? A whisper, a breath, a flicker behind the curtain. Not enough to see clearly, just enough to know that whatever lives in that house is already watching you back. And this tiny flickering awareness is your first step into the abyss. Because the house on Muirwoods Road wasn't just hiding a secret, it was feeding one. There are certain mornings in quiet neighborhoods when the world feels almost too peaceful, as if something is holding its breath. Before the horror of the Turpin home was known, there were days like that, soft, golden California mornings where the sun fell gently across Muirwoods Road, painting long shadows from mailboxes, tricycles, and trees that had seen decades of children come and go. And on those mornings, that pale house blended in. Just another shape among suburban shapes, just another roof beneath the watercolor sky. If you passed by early enough, you might even imagine the faintest innocence still clinging to the edges of that home, as though once, long before everything went wrong, something gentle had lived there. Once upon a time, before silence became a weapon, there were children inside those rooms who carried the same soft hopes all children carry. But innocence is a fragile thing. It can wither in the dark just as quickly as flowers left without water. Tonight, we slow our steps and drift through those earlier years, not to sanctify them, but to understand the shadow that would later swallow everything whole. In the early days, neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of the Turpin children, not often just flashes, a line of them walking to the van, heads down, their clothes always matching as if they'd been sewn from the same bolt of fabric. Their hair long, shiny, identical, a strange kind of symmetry, beautiful from far away, disturbing up close. Sometimes a child would lift their head for just a moment, a brief spark of curiosity or longing or fear lighting their eyes, but always a parent's voice would call them back inside, soft, controlled, final. No one ever saw scraped knees, messy hair, muddy shoes. No one heard laughter, not even once. It was a family portrait with no fingerprints, a life too polished, a calm too absolute, and every unnatural calm has a price. The town itself, Perris, California, carried a kind of desert quiet. Hot days, cool nights, and long stretches of stillness where sound traveled slowly. Perfect conditions for a secret to take root. If you had walked past the Turpin house in those early years, you might have noticed little things, not enough to raise alarms, just enough to linger in the mind afterward. A single curtain always drawn, a child staring through the window long after the sun had set. Lights flicking on at hours when other families slept. The absence of bicycles, the absence of voices, the absence of life. Small things, seeds. But seeds grow. One neighbor, an older woman who walked her dog at the same time every day, later said she often felt watched when she passed that house. Not by someone looking out a window, but by someone afraid to be seen. She described it like this: "Sometimes I felt a pair of eyes behind the curtain, but the moment I looked up, the curtain stopped moving. A breeze, a shadow, a child pulling back in fear, she never knew. But the feeling stayed with her, and feelings in stories like this are often the first warnings." Inside the house, a very different kind of world was forming. A world where time was bent, rituals replaced routine, and silence settled like dust on every surface. But from the outside, nothing had cracked yet. The rot was still hidden under layers of gentle mornings and ordinary suburban life. And the symbols, the quiet ones that echo forward, were already forming. A locked door at the end of a hallway, a family photo with faces too aligned, a name carved into the underside of a bunk bed, the sound of soft footsteps in the middle of the night, a notebook hidden beneath a mattress, a whisper shared between siblings when they thought no one could hear. You won't understand these symbols completely yet. You're not meant to. Not until later. Not until the house begins to unravel. Not until the children's voices, long buried, begin to rise. But here, in this quiet chapter before the storm, we sit in the calm that always comes before tragedy blooms. We breathe, we linger, we listen to the stillness, because every nightmare begins softly, every curse begins with a calm that feels almost holy. And every family that hides behind perfect photographs is always hiding something else just outside the frame. And soon, that frame will crack. The day the first crack appeared, no one noticed immediately. The sun was high, the air still, and the Turpin house rested in its usual silence. But inside, a shift had begun, a single note in a symphony of control that would slowly unravel the years of meticulous order. It started with small contradictions: a child missing from breakfast, a door unlocked that should have been sealed, the faint scent of food left to rot, even as their bodies shrank from hunger. These were subtle details that most outsiders would overlook, yet for anyone who looked closely, they were impossible. A neighbor remembered seeing a boy outside once, thin, pale, stooped, carrying a small, tattered notebook. He ran quickly when he noticed her gaze, disappearing behind a curtain. That notebook would later become one of the first keys to understanding the world inside the Turpin home. Inside those walls, the impossible was becoming ordinary. Children who should have been asleep at night wandered quietly in hallways, speaking in whispers only they could hear. Some carried chains, others bore bruises that never fully faded. The boundaries between control and chaos were already breaking. Rumors began to float through the neighborhood. Strange shapes in the windows, shadows moving against the walls, the faint sound of singing at impossible hours. No one could confirm anything. And in that ambiguity, the cracks widened, because the mind fills in what it cannot see. There were hints of a pattern, a rhythm of cruelty so precise that it was almost ceremonial. Sleep, wake, food, silence. Every act measured, every act observed. Children moved like chess pieces on a board too large for their small bodies. And yet, from the outside, nothing appeared wrong. Neighbors smiled politely. The mailman delivered packages. The lawn remained mowed. The facade of normalcy endured. It was a house designed to hide what no one wanted to see. Even within the family, a quiet fracture began. Siblings whispered to each other in the shadows, the older ones guiding the younger ones through a world they did not understand. Not in defiance, but in survival. They learned to navigate the twisted map of control, to read the subtle cues of when a parent's gaze was about to strike and when silence could be safe. And in that forced intimacy, a strange closeness developed between them, not born of choice, but of the stark, unyielding need for human connection. This is where the story begins to twist. Love and fear, guidance and manipulation, blurred into one another in ways that no child should ever understand. Outside the house, the first hints of concern began to form. A neighbor saw a child on the porch, looking out with eyes far too old for their years. The child's lips moved in a whisper, but no words carried beyond the glass. Another neighbor noted that one of the children had vanished for hours during the day, returning later with a strange, almost rehearsed smile. These moments were fleeting, almost imperceptible, but each was a crack in the carefully constructed illusion. And cracks, once begun, do not stop. At night, the house itself seemed to respond. Flickering lights cast elongated shadows. The wind rattled the blinds like skeletal fingers. Distant laughter, too high-pitched and soft to belong to anyone outside, echoed down the halls. The first whispers of rebellion, not loud or violent, but tiny and almost invisible, began to take root. The children had begun to notice one another, to share secret words and plans. Their whispered stories formed patterns, maps of hope, desperation, and fleeting courage. And the parents' control, once absolute, was beginning to stretch, like old leather cracking under tension. The first crack was more than a moment. It was a realization. The world inside the house, so meticulously curated, was not perfect. It was fragile. And the fragile sometimes breaks silently, in broad daylight, before anyone knows it has happened. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the children had already begun to speak to each other in a language only they could understand. Once the first crack appeared, there was no turning back. The house itself seemed to inhale differently, the air heavier, warmer, as if it were aware of its own slow unraveling. Inside, the children began to notice patterns in the silences and in the small routines imposed upon them. A parent's step on the stairs, the subtle click of a lock, the precise timing of meals, all these cues became their world. And in that world, fear and love were inseparable. The descent was not loud. It was measured, slow, like water seeping into cracks in a foundation. No single scream or shout could mark the beginning, only the accumulation of invisible bruises, hidden chains, and the quiet erosion of innocence. Older siblings carried the weight of younger ones. They whispered words to soothe trembling hands. They offered comfort while hiding their own terror. Every gesture became ritualized, a survival language built of glances, whispers, and shadowed footsteps. And in that language, the children learned to navigate the incomprehensible rules of their captors. From the outside, the family remained a picture of normalcy. Parents smiling for cameras, children obedient and quiet. But the facade began to crack in subtler ways. A neighbor who peeked through a window might glimpse a child standing too still, or eyes darting in ways that did not match their age. Some children would huddle together for warmth and comfort, while others remained rigid, like they had memorized the precise shape of fear. Even the pets in the house seemed to shrink away, as though they too recognized the unnatural order. The psychological decay unfolded like a shadow theater. Every day the children's minds stretched to accommodate the impossible, to survive in a house where light, food, affection, and freedom were all carefully rationed. The older children began to take on roles that should never belong to anyone so young. Guardians, protectors, negotiators, their small bodies carrying burdens too vast to name. Their whispered confessions to one another were acts of rebellion, tiny flickers of humanity against the overwhelming darkness. Halfway through this descent, a subtle rupture occurred. A small act, an older child attempting to hide a snack for a younger sibling, was met with disproportionate punishment. Not violent, exactly, but the tightening of chains, the cold glare of a parent, the silent accusation that words could not contain. It was a microcosm of the household's moral collapse. Control exercised through quiet terror, obedience enforced by omnipresent fear. Sound became a language. The creak of a floorboard could signal danger. A sigh could mean reprieve. Whispered names became codes, clues to navigate the hidden corners of the house. And in that small, dark world, love and necessity became tangled. Siblings became mirrors of each other's suffering. They learned to read the unspoken, to anticipate wrath, and to seek small acts of compassion where none was freely offered. The walls of the house seemed to shrink. Rooms that should have held freedom now felt like cages within cages. Every corner carried the echo of expectation, every hallway a pathway to dread. And yet, through the quiet, measured fear, a small current of hope began to circulate. Not hope of freedom, not yet, but the hope that perhaps a world beyond the walls existed, and that one day the children might find a way to touch it. By the end of the descent, the pattern was clear. The Turpin household was a machine of psychological imprisonment. Its gears were invisible, its cruelty quiet, its decay slow but inevitable. And the first real glimpse of liberation, tiny as it was, would come not from the outside, but from the children themselves, learning, ever so subtly, how to communicate beyond the chains. And somewhere in the shadows, one child began to dream of doors that didn't exist yet. And somewhere in the shadows, one child began to dream of doors that didn't exist yet. The breaking point did not arrive with a crash. It arrived quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor as the last candle flickered out. Years of control, starvation, silence, and ritualized fear had built a tension so absolute that even the smallest act could topple it. And that act came not from the parents, but from within. A small, trembling voice, a spark of courage hidden beneath years of submission. It was one of the older children, a girl whose hands were weak from hunger, whose voice had almost forgotten the sound of laughter. She whispered a plan to a sibling, not with bravado, but with a quiet, unshakable determination. We have to, one day. The others listened. Some hesitated, some nodded in silence. And in that room, for the first time, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The first major reveal of the Turpin house was not the chains, the hunger, or the locked doors. It was the scale of it. Authorities, when they finally arrived months later, would find 13 children living in conditions that defied belief. Some were barely able to walk. Some had been chained to beds for years. Some bore the silent marks of an upbringing so twisted that even the smallest gestures of normalcy had become foreign. And yet, at the moment of realization, the parents' perfect facade cracked. Not with anger, but with an almost mechanical defense. Minimization, denial, rehearsed calm. Inside the house, the first ripple of rebellion had begun to spread. A child's whispered plan, a notebook hidden beneath a mattress, an escape route traced in pencil, all small acts that slowly undermined the tyranny. And here lies the first twist within the twist. The children's bonds, shaped by years of enforced proximity, had become their strength. Not out of affection alone, but necessity. The relationships formed in silence, in shared fear, were now the tools of survival. It was impossible for the parents to fully control them. The seed of defiance had been planted. Outside, the world still slept. Neighbors, oblivious to the years of suffering, continued their routines. And in that gap between observation and truth, the house thrummed with tension. The quiet breaking point was both psychological and moral. Inside, the children learned that silence could be defied, that whispers could travel further than chains, that unity could become resistance. But the emotional fallout was immediate. Even as hope stirred, the weight of memory and fear pressed down. The older children now carried responsibility for those younger than them. Every step toward freedom came with guilt. Every whisper of rebellion carried the tremor of danger. And the parents, David and Louise Turpin, remained statues of control, their authority intact in appearances, but fragile underneath. Sound became a weapon and a signal. The soft click of a lock, the rustle of paper, the whisper of footsteps, all were coded messages, each one a tiny defiance, each one a pulse of courage pushing against the weight of years. By the end of this breaking point, the story had shifted. It was no longer only about abuse and control. It was about the first spark of resistance, the first glimmer that survival was possible even under the most impossible circumstances. And somewhere in the quiet, a plan was forming, a plan that no adult in the house could yet imagine. Once the breaking point had passed, the house began to move in a rhythm all its own, a rhythm of tension and release, of hope and fear, of whispered plans that met invisible walls. The spiral had begun. Inside, the children's small acts of defiance started to ripple outward. A notebook hidden beneath a mattress, a whispered conversation under covers, a silent gesture passed between siblings. All these tiny rebellions fed an invisible current that was slowly reshaping the household. The parents, David and Louise, remained almost impossibly composed, but cracks were beginning to show. A door left unlocked, a glance that lingered too long, a punishment deferred because a parent hesitated, unsure whether to strike or step back. And the children noticed. Eyes sharpened, movements became more deliberate. Chains still held, but control had lost its absolute edge. Outside the house, whispers began to grow. Neighbors recalled strange lights flickering at odd hours, the faint sound of footsteps in hallways that should have been empty, and a rumor began to circulate, softly, almost imperceptibly. Something isn't right in that house. No one could know the full truth, not yet, but the air of suspense began to hang heavy in the streets. Inside, the spiral accelerated. The children became teachers and students to each other. Older ones explained the silent language of survival, showed the younger ones how to move unseen, how to read a parent's mood like a storm cloud. And in that strange, impossible network of trust, love, and fear danced together. It was not affection in the conventional sense, but a necessary bond to endure a house built entirely of control and starvation. Auditory cues became the heartbeat of the household. The soft click of a door signaled danger. A cough or a sigh was both warning and code. Every whisper carried multiple meanings, a plea, a plan, a reassurance. And outside that world, the outside world remained blind. The spiral was private, contained, but it was unstoppable. A symbolic foreshadowing began to emerge. A clock in the hallway, always frozen at the same hour, became a secret marker for plans whispered in the shadows. The same photograph, hanging crooked on a wall, was passed over repeatedly by those seeking courage. Even small objects, a chipped plate, a frayed blanket, took on hidden meanings that the children could read and the parents could not. And yet, the spiral was not uniform. Some children fell further into fear. Some clung desperately to hope. Some spoke in silence, their minds turning over every possible scenario for escape or survival. It was a rhythm of chaos and calm, the heartbeat of the house itself. A calm afternoon might be shattered by a whispered command. A quiet evening might be broken by a child's soft defiance. And in that pulse of tension, every moment was an emotional jolt. The outside world remained unaware, but the seeds of liberation were growing within. The children had begun to understand that survival required more than silence. It required strategy, observation, and patience. And in that quiet spiral of fear and courage, something else began to take shape. A subtle understanding that their world was finite, and that freedom existed, somewhere beyond the walls. But one evening, in the dim glow of the hallway, a single mistake would push the house closer to collapse than ever before. The revelation did not arrive with sirens, nor with shouting. It arrived quietly, like the first gust of wind through a cracked window that carries a chill deep into your bones. Inside the Turpin house, the children's whispers had grown bold enough to reach the ears of someone from the outside, a neighbor, finally noticing the shadows beneath the drawn curtains, the children who seemed older than their years, their eyes too aware, too still. The first outsider to grasp the truth wasn't a lawman, it was a teacher. Someone who had noticed absences, strangeness in the children's appearance, their thin frames and hollow expressions. And slowly, like an unraveling thread, the scale of the household's horror began to emerge. The children were 13 in number, starved, isolated, and confined for years. Some were chained to their beds. Some carried injuries from punishment that no one outside could see. Some had never felt the warmth of sunlight or the touch of normal affection. And yet, The revelation was not simply in the physical abuse. It was in the realization of what had been stolen. Childhood itself, the ability to know the world beyond four walls, the right to human connection. Eyewitness accounts, written reports, and the fragments of diaries and notebooks revealed a meticulous, deliberate control that had stretched across decades. But the hardest truth, the one that lingered after every document was read, was this. The isolation had created a world of its own, a distorted ecosystem of fear, necessity, and silent rebellion. Within it, the children had adapted, learning to survive by observing, calculating, and communicating in ways that no outside person could understand. One child recalled, years later, "We didn't know the world existed, so we made our own." That sentence, so simple, captures the haunting core of the Turpin story. When a child has nothing, they invent life in the shadows. They map survival like a hidden language, like breathing in a room where oxygen is rationed. And yet, revelation is never complete. Even as authorities arrived, as chains were unlocked, as beds were dismantled, as the world gasped in horror, a piece of the story remained unreachable. The children's internal lives, their fear, their courage, their subtle acts of defiance, could never be fully observed. Some truths are lived, not seen. Emotion layered upon revelation. The parents, David and Louise, stood, almost rehearsed, their faces masks of calm and denial. The children, fragile yet steadfast, were both victims and survivors. And in that fragile dichotomy, viewers cannot help but feel both horror and awe. The revelation also brought the unspoken question, how had this gone unnoticed for so long? And the answer, whispered softly, is always the same in stories like this, because no one truly wants to see the ordinary as a mask for the extraordinary. Because cruelty often hides behind calm, and silence can be the most perfect camouflage. By the end of this chapter, we understand the magnitude of the horror, but we do not yet feel its full echo. The children's survival is a light, faint, but unbroken, cutting through the oppressive shadows that still linger in the corners of the mind. And as you listen, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of footsteps in empty hallways, the whispered words passed between siblings, the slow rhythm of courage beginning to take form. But even with the truth revealed, the shadows of the house had not yet released their grip, and the collapse was only beginning. The collapse did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in waves, a quiet, inexorable falling apart that felt as if the house itself were breathing its last, its walls sagging under the weight of decades of control, its floors bowed beneath the secrets it had carried. Inside, the children felt it first. The air shifted. The chains, once taut and immovable, seemed suddenly brittle. The authority that had dictated every movement, every meal, every whispered thought began to falter in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. And yet the collapse was not relief. It was terror mingled with liberation. For years, the children had learned to read shadows like maps, to anticipate wrath and avoid mistakes, to live small lives inside a giant machine. Suddenly, the machine broke, and with it, every certainty they had clung to was stripped away. They were free. But freedom had no instructions. The parents, David and Louise, stood amid the chaos of their own creation, faces masks of disbelief and mechanical calm. Their world, built of fear, silence, and ritual, was crumbling around them. Authorities documented the physical devastation, beds rusted with age, chains anchored to walls, rooms bare of warmth, hallways darkened by years of neglect. But the psychological collapse, the weight of years in silent terror pressing down on minds that had never known normalcy, was less visible, but infinitely more profound. The children, fragile yet resilient, moved cautiously through the ruins. Some wept openly, the flood of emotion they had held in check for years now breaking free. Others remained still, absorbing the enormity of the shift, their minds cataloging each sensation, each expression of relief or grief, learning how to exist outside the strict architecture of fear. Silence filled the house in a new way, no longer oppressive, no longer a tool of control. Instead, it was a space to breathe, to imagine, to reconstruct what life might feel like without constant surveillance. Even the walls seemed to sigh, as if releasing decades of held-back weight. Yet the collapse carried shadows. Habits formed in captivity did not dissolve instantly. The children flinched at doors left ajar, wavered at normal human gestures, and sometimes paused mid-step, as if expecting punishment that would never come. The trauma was tangible, a quiet specter that would linger for years. It was a reminder that survival is not the same as healing. And outside the house, the world reacted. Neighbors, police, and media finally glimpsed the impossible. 13 children, hidden for years, living in conditions that defied belief. The revelation spread like wildfire. The Turpins were arrested, their house entered by strangers for the first time in decades. And yet, even in that public collapse, the personal, intimate horror, the whispered language of survival, the small acts of courage and love that had kept 13 lives intact, remained largely invisible. By the end of the collapse, the Turpin home stood as both ruin and monument, a testament to control, to isolation, to human cruelty, but also quietly to resilience. And as you sit with this knowledge, let the quiet linger. Let the grief, the horror, and the bravery resonate in the spaces between your thoughts. Because history repeats itself, not always in loud tragedy, but in the subtle echoes of silence that follow a collapse. But that wasn't the end, not by far. The ruins held one last secret, waiting to be uncovered. The aftermath arrived slowly, like fog rolling over the hills at dawn. The house on Muirwoods Road was emptied of its captors, but its silence remained. Its walls carried the weight of 13 lifetimes, compressed into rooms too small for such sorrow. For the children, the world outside was unfamiliar, bright, loud, unstructured, unpredictable. Every step forward carried echoes of what had been, the long years of chains and whispers, of hunger and quiet terror. Outside observers saw only a rescue, a family freed, a story concluded. But the truth of aftermath is never neat. Trauma lingers in the mind like shadow. It shapes the way one sees light. It teaches caution in every gesture, hesitation in every movement, even as freedom stretches its strange, alien hands toward young bodies unaccustomed to choice. Therapists and social workers documented progress in charts, but the invisible layers, the subtle trust issues, the tremor of fear in routine tasks, the soft but persistent echo of parental authority, cannot be charted. They are felt in every quiet glance, in every instinctive flinch. And yet, even amid the residual fear, small victories emerged. The children learned laughter. They learned play. They discovered affection and warmth, sometimes for the first time in years. Generational consequences also lingered. The Turpin story is more than an isolated nightmare. It is a testament to the ways control and cruelty can pass invisibly through families. Neighbors, friends, and siblings all carry pieces of memory, and the house itself became a cautionary monument, a reminder that horror often hides behind ordinary facades. The physical house still stands in memory, its locked doors, its chained beds, its hallways where silence was law. For some of the children, even years later, dreams return to the hallways, to whispers in dark corners, to the sense that the walls themselves were alive and watching. Yet amidst the ruins there is a quiet beauty. The resilience of human connection, even when born from forced intimacy, even when shaped by isolation and fear, is undeniable. The children's survival is both a miracle and a testament to the unyielding strength of hope buried deep beneath horror. Outside, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The world resumed its rhythms. But the Turpin house and the story it contained left traces, tiny, almost invisible shadows that whisper in the corners of anyone who listens closely. And sometimes, when the wind drifts just right, it carries a faint echo, the sound of chains being moved, of whispered strategies, of children plotting in secret. The aftermath is not only what survives, but what continues to haunt, the invisible echoes of fear, courage, and human resilience that ripple through time, through memory, through history. Even after freedom, some shadows remained, whispers of a past that refused to die. Even now, years after the doors were forced open, the Turpin house continues to speak. Not in words, not in sound, but in the spaces it left behind. The rooms where shadows learned to move, the hallways where silence became a teacher, the beds where fear and necessity intertwined. History does not end. It echoes, it drifts like smoke through generations. And in that echo, we hear not only horror, but resilience. The children, now free, carry pieces of that house with them. Not in chains or bruises, but in instinct, in memory, in the quiet ways their bodies and minds respond to the world beyond the walls. And those echoes reach further than we imagine. Reminders that cruelty often hides behind ordinary facades, that human resilience can survive even the most absolute control, that hope, even tiny and flickering, can outlast despair. Outside, the house stands empty. The neighborhood continues its hum. Yet for those who know the story, it is never truly silent. The echoes are subtle, the faint sound of footsteps in the hall, a child's whisper barely audible, a shadow moving where no one should be. And for viewers, for listeners, for anyone who has traced this path through horror and courage, there is a final lesson. Sometimes, the most lasting marks are not the ones we see, but the ones we carry inside. The Turpin story is over in the sense that captivity ended, but it is not over in the mind. It lingers in reflection, in nightmares, in empathy, in the recognition of how fragile childhood can be and how strong the human spirit remains. And so the echo returns us to the beginning, to the calm before the rot, to the whispered words in the hallways, to the moments when fear and courage intertwined like two shadows in a dimly lit room. Maybe it wasn't just madness. Maybe it wasn't just cruelty. Maybe it was inheritance, not of blood, but of silence and survival. And in that final, lingering thought, we leave the house behind, but the echo remains, haunting us long after the doors have closed. Maybe it wasn't madness. Maybe it was inheritance.